Welcome to our series on the Westminster Confession of Faith. We are glad that you are here. Today we come to the seventh and final section of Chapter 5, which brings the entire chapter on providence to a glorious and deeply comforting conclusion. Over the past 6 sections, we have explored the full scope of God's governance, from the comprehensive foundation in Section 1 through the difficult questions of providence and sin in Section 4 to the contrasting experiences of believers and the wicked in Sections 5 and 6. Now, in this closing section, the confession declares that while God's providence reaches all creatures universally, it takes special care of His church and disposes all things for the church's good. This is the crown of the doctrine of providence, and it is the truth that ties every previous section together into one beautiful, coherent whole. Let us see what the confession teaches. We have come to the final section of Chapter 5, the conclusion of the Westminster Confession's teaching on the doctrine of providence. Over the past 6 sections, we have explored the full scope of God's governance. In Section 1, we saw that God upholds, directs, disposes, and governs all things, from the greatest to the least. In Section 2, we learned that He works through second causes that operate according to their own natures. In Section 3, we discovered that God ordinarily uses means, but is free to work without, above, and against them. In Section 4, we confronted the hardest question: how God's providence extends even to sin without God being the author of sin. In Section 5, we saw how God lovingly disciplines His own children through trials. And in Section 6, we witnessed the sobering reality of God's judicial hardening of the wicked. Now in this closing section, the confession brings all of these truths to their glorious climax. While God's providence reaches all creatures without exception, it takes special care of His church. This is the most comforting statement in the entire chapter, the truth that every believer needs most. Let us now read the text of Westminster Confession, Chapter 5, Section 7. As the providence of God doth in general reach to all creatures, so after a most special manner it taketh care of His church, and disposeth all things to the good thereof. This brief but powerful statement contains 2 parallel truths. First, God's providence reaches all creatures. Everything we have learned in sections 1 through 6 applies universally. Nothing falls outside His governance. Second, within that universal providence, God exercises a special particular care for His church. He does not merely govern the church as He governs everything else. He takes care of it after a most special manner, with a covenantal redemptive love that goes beyond His general governance of creation. The confession begins by summarizing the entire chapter. God's providence reaches all creatures. This is the comprehensive truth we have been studying across 6 sections. God upholds all things in being. Without His sustaining power, nothing would continue to exist. He directs all things toward their appointed ends. Nothing drifts aimlessly in God's world. He disposes every circumstance according to His will. Every detail is arranged by His sovereign hand. And He governs every event with absolute authority. Nothing can resist His purposes or frustrate His plan. This universal scope means there are no gaps in God's governance. There are no dark corners of the universe where God is absent. No events where He is uninvolved. No creatures that fall outside His care. Every atom, every creature, every nation, every moment of history falls under His sovereign governance. Berkhof calls this God's providentia generalis, His general providence that extends to the entirety of creation. It is the broad canvas on which the whole drama of redemption is painted. And it is the foundation on which the next truth, God's special care for His church, rests securely. But within this universal providence, there is a special providence. The confession says God takes care of His church after a most special manner. This is what the older theologians called God's providentia specialissima, His most particular, most loving, most attentive care directed toward His covenant people. The church is not just another creature in God's world. The church is the body of Christ, purchased with His own blood. The church is the bride of the Lamb, cherished with an everlasting love. The church is the people of God, chosen before the foundation of the world and destined for eternal glory. God's relationship to his church is not merely sovereign, it is covenantal, redemptive, and personal. He watches over his church with the tender love of a father for his children and the jealous devotion of a bridegroom for his bride. Berkhof explains that this special providence includes God's work of gathering his people from every nation, protecting them from their enemies, providing for their needs, and preserving them until the day of Christ's return. He raises up leaders for the church, equips believers for service, defeats the powers that oppose his people, and ensures that the gates of hell will never prevail against the church he is building. This special care does not mean the church is exempt from difficulty. As we learned in Section 5, God sometimes permits his people to face trials for their refinement and growth. But it does mean that every trial is governed by a God who loves his church with an infinite, unchangeable, and everlasting love. The confession concludes that God disposeth all things to the good of the church. This is perhaps the most comforting phrase in the entire chapter. Every circumstance, every event, every trial, every loss, every hardship, all of it is arranged by God for the ultimate benefit of his people. This echoes the great promise that the Apostle Paul gives in his letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Notice what this verse does and does not say. It does not say that all things are good. Many things in this fallen world are terrible, painful, and heartbreaking. But it says that God works all things together for good. He takes the raw materials of history, including sin, suffering, persecution, betrayal, and death, and he weaves them together into a tapestry that serves his church's ultimate flourishing and his own eternal glory. The history of the church itself proves this truth beyond any doubt. The persecution of the early Christians by the Roman Empire scattered believers throughout the known world. But that very scattering became the means by which the gospel spread to the ends of the earth. The great heresies that threatened to destroy the church in its early centuries produced the ecumenical creeds and confessions that have guided believers for nearly 2,000 years. The suffering of the martyrs, far from destroying the church, became the seed from which it grew stronger. Robert Shaw observes that this truth has sustained the church through every trial in its long history. No matter what the church faces, whether political oppression, cultural hostility, persecution, or internal division, God is working all things for the good of his people. This is not a hope or a wish. It is the certain promise of the sovereign God who governs all things. Question 1. The distinction shows that the church has a unique place in God's purposes. While God cares for all creation, his people are the special object of his redemptive love. This gives the church confidence in its mission. We serve a God who is actively working all things for our good. Question 2. Church history provides abundant examples. The Reformation came through tremendous conflict, but recovered the gospel for millions. Missionaries throughout history have faced persecution that ultimately opened doors for the gospel in new lands. In personal experience, many believers can point to painful seasons that God used for spiritual growth. Question 3. The doctrine of providence means that nothing in our lives is random, meaningless, or beyond God's control. He governs all things, from the greatest to the least, and he does so with wisdom, holiness, and love. For his church, he goes even further, disposing all things for our good. This truth can sustain us through any trial. As we conclude chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession, let us gather together everything we have learned. God's providence reaches all creatures without exception. He upholds, directs, disposes, and governs everything, from the greatest cosmic events to the smallest details of daily life. He works through second causes that operate according to their own natures, necessarily, freely, or contingently. He ordinarily uses means, but is never bound by them. His providence extends even to sin, which he bounds, orders, and governs for his own holy ends without being its author. He disciplines his children in love, using trials to humble them, reveal hidden corruption, and deepen their dependence on his grace. And he hardens the wicked in judgment, withdrawing his restraint and giving them over to the consequences of their own sin. But the crown of all these truths is what Section 7 declares. Within this universal providence, God takes special care of His church. He disposes all things, even the darkest and most painful circumstances, for the ultimate good of His people. This is not wishful thinking. This is not mere optimism. This is the certain, unshakable promise of a sovereign, wise, holy, and loving God. The same God who governs the stars also governs the trials of His people, and He does so with a Father's tender care. Thank you for joining us throughout this study of the doctrine of providence. May these truths strengthen your faith and deepen your trust in the God who governs all things, for His glory and for your good.